Here goes. We're overdue in developing conceptual maps of media industries that include creators and the dynamics of media making and circulation that enable them. The mode of cultural production that dominated 20th century theory building and was assumed as normal of media operation now persists in parallel with newer dynamics. The new media environment of the 21st century, regarded as some as creator culture or the creator economy, has attracted much interest from scholars, but little systematic conceptualization. Historically, critical scholarship about cultural production, Duguay et al., 1997, Hesman-Hausch, 2019, has been motivated by building a foundation for understanding the dynamics of production and circulation that produce cultural goods important to individuals and social processes. Much of this work has focused on questions around labor dynamics in making media, though the Circuit of Culture framework illustrated that critical scholars also understood changes in production and circulation could adjust the features of the cultural goods created, and that the changes in cultural goods could have implications for media's social function. The expanded capacity for the creation and circulation of media outside of gate-kept, legacy, complex professional dynamics, per Hesman-Hausch 2019, is a substantial development from previous norms of cultural production. Media goods produced by the so-called creator economy are not the only cultural goods most users want, but they have become a significant part of media diets and have captured enough attention in the marketplace to redefine the playing field of the rest of the sector. The scope of their use is somewhat hidden by the largely fragmented consumption conditions now typical. A handful of creators or type of content may be somewhat widely known, Mr. Beast, Logan Paul, but such cases do not capture the depth and breadth of cultural goods produced under dynamics notably different from historical structures and practices. What is generally regarded as the creator economy persists without clear conceptualization of its distinction from established practice or internal variation. Its structural disparities from pre-digital norms of media operation are poorly understood, and three differentiating factors from pre-digital norms are commonly conflated. This conceptual analysis identifies how long-held and well-established norms no longer provide as exhaustive conceptualization of the media sector. A key assumption of what David Hesman-Hausch has usefully theorized as complex professional cultural production was the contractual license between media makers and circulating organizations, which afforded the circulating organizations determinative industrial authority by virtue of their funding and control over circulation. As it is in Pool 2025 identify, internet distribution enables the emergence of a hosting model that contrasts with the licensed relationship between media makers and circulators, or what they term a commissioning model. Hosted media making was also initially differentiated by the ability of sole proprietors to establish media making enterprises that might be considered simple professional cultural production in comparison with existing complex professional norms. By the 2020s, a select few of those sole proprietors grew their enterprises into businesses of dozens to hundreds of employees that were increasingly characteristic of complex professional norms, even if reliant on hosted circulation. In addition to adjustments in established norms tied to hosted and more simple professional operation, the broader context of media operation has changed from mass media reach and logics of operation to conditions that can be comparatively regarded as those of micromedia. Crucially, although micromedia reach is typically assumed of hosted media, by the 2020s, even most complex professional cultural production also reached an audience scale understandable as micromedia relative to past norms. The feasibility of hosted, simple professional media creation and the fracturing of mass media norms reshape the grounds for critical understanding and necessitate investigation of discrepancies in practices of cultural production and their implications for media's social and cultural functions. To be clear, this investigation does not assert hosted, simple professional dynamics are replacing commissioned complex professional media making. Rather, decades of coexistence seem likely, The article first offers concise explanation of the three differentiating factors, which are difficult to extricate in examining contemporary media operation. These differences in cultural production dynamics and context are commonly conflated into a singular creator economy and culture, which prevents the nuanced analysis needed to build proper critical understanding of this new media sector. The main section of the article then investigates the implications of how a hosted model of media circulation deviates from established, licensed, complex professional conditions, particularly in relation to creative autonomy. The analysis engages primarily with media studies or sociological understanding of cultural production, but incorporates analytic concepts from media economics in arguing the need to break from the hegemony of mass media logics to understand the political economy of the 21st century environment. Differentiating changes in cultural production. Abundant research, often referenced as studies of creator culture, has prioritized in-depth investigation of creators' accounts of their practices. These studies have revealed considerable detail about the production culture and creators' experience of platform power, but lack systematic conceptualization of the sector, its differentiation from pre-digital cultural production, or consideration of meaningful industrial subcategories of operation. The focus here on a categorization of patterns and features of cultural production is concentrated at a meso-industrial level and not meant to replace the micro-level analysis of creator culture or creator studies that extends well beyond the dynamics of cultural production. Systematic analysis of the imagined creator economy has been and remains very difficult due to the absence of public data comparable to that gathered by governments or required of publicly traded corporations. Investor sector hype, driven especially by advertisers and their representatives, offers estimates but tends to conflate quite different businesses and fails to account for the peculiarity of media businesses, outlined by Caves 2000. This analysis draws from the findings of creator-level research and public disclosures of media makers in the sector to conceptualize the implications at a sector level in the absence of comprehensive industrial data to map structural differences in cultural production practices from those of pre-digital conditions. Commissioning versus hosting models. The first of the triad of differentiating factors is the distinction of operating with a hosting versus commissioning model, as identified by Itis and Poole. Although only glancingly noted in an article focused on platform power and screen industries, the authors usefully give name to a key industrial difference. The emergence of services that merely host content is essential to enabling this media sector. This is a crucial structural difference, not that it is user-generated or internet distributed, as suggested by alternative terminological distinctions that have guided categorization. Historically, media content has been commissioned or licensed through a formal contract involving the exchange of money for rights to circulate content. In a licensed media environment, circulation largely required a formal contract-based relationship between the maker and circulator with some level of guaranteed remuneration for content. It also included a negotiated agreement over ownership rights reflected in the remuneration. Terms of service that are typical of software licenses and many of these hosted services are not comparable to how licensing has worked in media businesses. Hosted media circulate on relatively open services such as YouTube, Substack, social media, app stores, or any service that circulates content created independently of the paid, commissioned, or licensed agreement that has long been typical of licensed media making. Hosted circulation is very different from how the pre-digital media sector and what we've called legacy, old, and corporate media work. In contrast, hosted media services require media makers to adhere to uniform terms of service that enable circulation on the service, but largely absolve it of any responsibility to the media maker or for the content distributed. The terms vary by service, but might require makers to grant worldwide, non-exclusive, royalty-free, sub-licensable, and transferable rights, require makers give services the right to monetize the content without entitling the maker to payment, and may give services rights to the content even after the maker removes it. As later sections explore, the dynamics of risk and reward differ significantly for media makers operating under hosted versus licensed conditions, although they are not wholly unprecedented. Similarities in the media making risk profile can be seen among hosted and truly independent filmmaking. Hosted versus licensed is valuable as a binary distinction that immediately signals significant differences in the relationships between makers and circulators and resulting conditions for media makers. Pre-digital media theory largely did not imagine the possibility of hosted media making. It reasonably assumed that the work of commercial media making or generation of intellectual property would be compensated. Of course, a non-commercial sector of hobbyist media making existed in the pre-digital era and also expands significantly in the 21st century due to the affordances that support hosted media making. But this article focuses on commercial media production. Complex professional versus simple professional cultural production. Simple professional cultural production categorizes the underlying production dynamics that differ from the complex professional dynamics Hesmanhausch highlights as pervasive in the 20th century cultural production norms. Complex professional structures require a project team working as a unified group with high skill specialization and division of labor. The sole proprietor operations of many hosted media makers strongly diverge. Complex professional cultural production became normalized in the 20th century to an extent its features, including licensed relations between media makers and circulators, have been regarded as inherent to commercial media making. I pose simple professional to engage with this established frame of understanding and to create differentiation within hosted media making. Hosted and simple professional media making overlap considerably, but are not perfectly aligned. And the possibilities for simple professional cultural production vary across word-based, audio, and video media making. In the 2010s, hosted simple professional video making emerged as an enterprise among YouTubers. But by the 2020s, the most established of that hosted video making became increasingly complex in its organization. In the case of Beast Enterprises, what began as a sole proprietor hosted video making scaled into an enterprise with hundreds of employees. See Shaw and Counts 2025, with dozens of employees being more common in hosted, increasingly complex professional operations. This growth into small to medium-sized businesses is more typical among video makers, with greater opportunity for simple professional hosted media operation in audio and word-based media making. This difference in operational scale creates variation within hosted media making that must be investigated. Hesmanhausch's complex professional cultural production provides a basis for comparing dynamics of large-scale hosted media making to explore the varied implications of hosted versus licensed relations. The discursive and implied conceptual frame of creator economy and origins of this media making work as by amateurs making user-generated content has perpetuated a mythology of sole proprietor enterprise and encouraged conflation of all hosted media making as a single coherent industrial sector. To be sure, it is difficult to extricate hosted circulation and simple professional cultural production. The latter largely requires the former. But as this article's analysis indicates, it is useful to identify hosted and simple professional as different divergences from previous norms, especially as an increasing number of hosted complex professional enterprises develop. Beast Enterprises, Hank Green's Complexly, Darmon Studios, that require a conceptual framework able to distinguish their operation from the sole proprietor structures connoted by creator. One further complicating note, these complex professional organizations increasingly operate in both hosted and licensed media making sectors. For example, Beast Enterprises spans production of the hosted Mr. Beast YouTube channel and licensed Beast games for Prime Video. It is most useful to categorize hosted versus licensed at a project level, while simple versus complex professional categorizes the scale of enterprises and the implications of that scale for operation. The categories of hosted media making and simple professional cultural production are needed because creator doesn't signal any certain structural distinction. Hosted is a very helpful distinction with discernible implications for media economics. And simple professional usefully allows us to conceptualize differences that don't tie directly to the hosted license distinction and frees us from the false dichotomy of creator versus corporate or legacy media conceptualization. Mass versus micromedia logics. The third differentiation identifies a shift in the macro norms of media reach and the underlying strategies that result, described here as a shift from conditions supporting mass media logics to micromedia logics. Developments tied to digital technologies and hosted circulation are crucial to enabling simple professional dynamics. But the contextual change that can be described as the end of mass media also must be foreground. Most hosted and simple professional cultural production achieves commercial success by reaching a small fraction of the audience scope typical of the 20th century mass media norms. That reach is termed micromedia here. Crucially, and in italics, mass reach was also profoundly diminished and increasingly abnormal for media produced within licensed and complex professional dynamics by the early 21st century. At least in the US. This transition varies by national context. Table 1 suggests general distinctions across a continuum of mass to micromedia based on analysis of historical and contemporary use that indicates changes in US video culture. Highlighting the viability and now common operation of commercial micromedia addresses a crucial contextual change in the scale of normal media reach that is part of building a conceptual frame for cultural production in the 2020s. Mass media logics encompass more than a media goods reach, but invoke a set of operating structures that Michael Curtin, 96, suggests is valuably viewed as an aberration rather than the imagined norm they grew into during the mid to late 20th century. As used here, mass media references the underlying logic that came to support much 20th century media strategy, a commercial operating structure built on complex professional dynamics and licensed media that encouraged and discouraged textual features in order to be attractive to a broad, heterogeneous consumer base in a manner that narrowed the range of commercially viable content, or at least perceptions of it. It was also a period in which pre-digital technological affordances of broadcasting and the cost of physical good manufacture and circulation enabled scarcity that supported the hegemony of complex professional operation that consolidated media ownership throughout the century. Most existing understanding of media industry operation in the 20th century was thus built on assuming mass media logics as natural, instead of conceptualizing them as structuring complex professional cultural production. Mass media logics and complex professional dynamics of cultural production are not synonymous, although little differentiation was made in the 20th century when both seemed required for optimal commercial return. Also, both assume licensed circulation. Hosted and simple professional cultural production emerge after mass media logics, have been in decline for a quarter century, at least in US video culture, and had become residual to norms better characterized as mid-media relative to the mass micro continuum or niche in the parlance of the time, although the implications of this shift were rarely acknowledged or addressed by industry journalists or scholars. In sum, cultural production has changed considerably in the last quarter century due to connected but distinct phenomena, including the demise of mass media logics and emergence of affordable digital production tools and opportunities for hosted circulation that support a simple professional dynamic in parallel to continued complex professional dynamics. At present, there is reason to suggest hosted, simple, and complex professional dynamics, as well as licensed complex professional dynamics, may coexist for some time. Though all are commercial modes of operation, their structural differences require deeper investigation and theory building relative to critical media concerns, such as creative autonomy and various relations of power. Establishing frames larger than cases of individual creators or operations of particular media monetization services, entities such as YouTube, Substack, or Patreon, that host or circulate the content, aids in conceptualization of both recent change and current operation. Understanding the variation among dynamics of cultural production support deeper appreciation of the opportunities to challenge corporate and state power, as well as how that power is reinscribed in new ways. Thanks.